Give us a talk on the life and times of the late Stan Gervas. Ian, would you like to come and give us a very interesting talk? Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk about Stan Gervas. I knew him for quite a while, some 55 years. He was my best friend for all of that time. Throughout most of those years, we lunched together every Friday, and there are witnesses here who can attest to that. Under those circumstances, you get to know a person quite well. In spite of that, Stan continued his regular lunches with me, right to the end. He was a good and loyal friend, and clearly very tolerant. So here I am now, and uninvited by you all, because Eileen, who was the one who was asked to speak, thought she might not be able to read her notes, which is poppycock, because Eileen shouldn't need notes. She's got a memory like an elephant. Now, as you can see, I'm not giving this talk off the cuff, for the very good reason, being the age I am. I was doubtful I would remember all the things I wanted to tell you. And in any case, Eileen may like to read it and consult her lawyer. Well, I think it's very appropriate that we're here this evening. The Peninsula Hotel and its builder marked a major turning point in Stan's life, or should I say, another major turning point, perhaps the last. There are at least a dozen different aspects of Stan's life I want to share with you, so this might take quite a while. I want to make the most of this opportunity. I might not get another. Hope your chairs are comfortable. Terry, what time does this place close?
We'll be happy to listen as long as you
Anyway, in the immortal words of Stan Albert Gervasini, for that was his real family name, I'll get on with it. Thank you, Ivan. I was waiting for you to say that. Get on with it. That's what he said, and that's how he lived his life. And that's how he badgered me when I was a young man. How he was able to get on with it when he was dealt the cards he was given is beyond me. And he did. And he did so with grace and confidence and respect for the dignity of everyone he met. The first real indication that he was born with a crooked leg was when at the tender age of 3 he fell while retrieving the cricket ball. No one, least of all Stan, knew that he had a congenital weakness in his hip. When he fell, he twisted his leg and his hip joint slipped out of its socket and sat above where it should have been. The pain was excruciating, and his siblings showed what they were made of by accusing him of being a grizzlegut, which was grossly unfair because Stan was never ever that. The result was that his left leg ended up being shorter than his right, obliging him to walk on tiptoe with his left foot, that is, until someone eventually made him a platform shoe. Now, as if that wasn't enough to contend with, when Stan was a little tyke, was 2 years old, the year before he discovered he had a bad leg, his father had died. However, he wasn't exactly left alone. He had his mother Kate and 4 siblings. He had 2 older sisters, Gladys and Dorothy, and he had 2 older brothers, Len and Ern. Interestingly, it was Dorothy, otherwise known as Doris, but more generally Dot, who took up the reins and guided the family through the difficult years of the Depression. And they were very difficult years indeed, especially without a father. His father Gus had started a farm near Coolin, cleared all the land himself, and then contracted TB. The farm was sold and the family moved to Narrogin, where Gus tried making axe handles for a living. With his death from TB imminent, he decided to get it over and done with, and he drowned himself in the river. It was some years before Stan discovered the circumstances of his father's death. He was struck with an unutterable sadness, and it stayed with him all his life. Occasionally it came up in our conversations, and it was always softly mentioned. He was never angry or resentful, that he grew up without a father, just sad. And Stan being Stan, he was equally sad for his father, as you can imagine. I ached for him. But Stan got on with it, and living in Narrogin brought him into contact with elements that would be signposts for his ultimate inclinations and directions. I've mentioned three of the factors that coloured his life. Well, now a fourth dimension was to bring real colour to his fertile mind. And I'm talking about motion pictures and music and books. Narrogin was not the cultural capital of Western Australia, but there was enough there to stimulate an impressionable youth like Stan. He didn't just go to the flicks for unthinking amusement. He absorbed every sight, every sound and every nuance. He developed an extraordinary memory for the lyrics of songs, for lines of verse. If he'd been born in America or England, I suspect he would have found his way into the movies. In his autobiography, From Coolum to Tuscany, Stan quoted from the legendary filmmaker J.P. Meyer of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer fame. He said, "Feature films exert the most powerful influence in our lives. The nature of this influence is a moral one, value patterns and actual behaviour. The outlook on life generally are manifestly shaped by film's influence." Well, Stan agreed with that up to a point. He wrote, "I don't believe that influence is quite so powerful, but I do know that personally it has provided me with many qualities for the better, just as reading has." Well, I think it affected him more than he knew. Stan's instincts for moral values were very strong, and they were reinforced by the standards of behaviour ground into him, especially by his sister Dot. And they were echoed in themes of films at that time. Well, in 1928, the family uprooted themselves from Narrogin and moved to Perth. Sister Gladys was already there. In the Big Smoke, Stan went to Perth High School in James Street and later found work, firstly at a knitting mill, then with a butcher, and then with Spalding's parking and taxi station in King Street, opposite His Majesty's Theatre. It was then that he learned to drive, with a few hair-raising incidents driving high-powered vehicles. But these jobs were only way stations because he was on a pathway to finding his true vocation. The first stepping stone was a correspondence course in advertising. Then he was given a few days' trial in Baird's advertising department. Remember Baird's? This turned out to be a fiasco. For a whole week he sorted ink-stained printing blocks, only to be told at the end that he was unsuitable. September 1939 brought with it the start of the Second World War, when the British declared war on Germany. But there was no immediate leap into warfare. For a while, people wondered if matters between Germany, Poland and Britain could be sorted out, and if not, what were the real implications. But during this brief hiatus, Stan one morning was reading the personal columns of the West Australian, not something he was generally prone to do, when he stumbled across an announcement that read, "Friendly male wishes to meet someone interested in sharing a holiday." Now remember this, Stan was almost 20, innocent of the world, and without any close friends. What could he be letting himself in for? He responded. In no time he met the advertiser, a Scot, whose name was Keilor Bruce. Keilor was 10 years older and equally friendless, obviously. They booked in at Cave's house in Yallingup, where it turned out there was a host of young people of similar age. Over the next 2 weeks, Stan, the relatively reticent and inhibited young man, was transformed into a natural leader. He organised outings, he played the fool, he kept everyone amused, he was amazed at himself. Suddenly, out of the blue, he discovered he had a vibrant wit. How and why did this happen? Stan didn't know, but he enjoyed the metamorphosis. It was one of those memorable turning points, many turning points in his life. As for Keilor, he and Stan stayed friends for the rest of their lives, even though Keilor eventually returned to the UK, over the years visiting each other in each other's countries. Long-term friendships were a characteristic of Stan. In 1952, it was Keilor who introduced Stan to Don Pierce, who he too became a lifelong close friend. And a few years later, Terry Spence, another denizen of Anybody here know Terry?
Yes, Kirsten, was nice.
He joined the inner circle. I should add that all these friendships embraced wives and children, literally and metaphorically. But back to late 1939, early 1940. The Second World War was hotting up, and it took thousands of young Australians to foreign countries and then took their lives. But it didn't take Stan. His wretched leg turned out to be a blessing in disguise, although he did not see it like that. Even though he rejoiced in physical activities like tennis or cricket, his leg was damning evidence that he was handicapped and unsuitable for strenuous physical work or hardship. What to do? What he did was to use his brains, of which he had more than his fair share. The bed's rejection notwithstanding, Stan decided a full frontal attack was the only solution. He invaded the office of 6 p.m. radio station in St George's Terrace, a few doors down from the newspaper house. He announced to the receptionist, in no uncertain terms, that he wanted to see Mr Frank Whitford, Papa Whitford as he was known, the legendary owner of the station and its network. Apparently Stan's bravado made an impression, barging in without an appointment and making his presence felt. He was told to wait in a passage before the great man would see him. Despite being as nervous as a cat on hot bricks, he got Papa Whitford's attention, who called in his sales manager to show him what had just walked in. Stan was flabbergasted when Papa Whitford asked him if he would like to be a radio announcer. This was promptly followed by an audition. Stan gave it everything he had, and just as he finished a paean of praise for Trousseau, remember Trousseau? The studio door swept open and Papa Whitford burst in and said, "Look here, you'll do. How much are you being paid where you are now?" Well, Papa Whitford offered Stan £4.10 a week, £1 a week more than he'd been getting. Stan's first thought was that he'd hit the big time, but that was for only a very brief moment. The job was at 6kg in Kalgoorlie, where he was to write ads and be on air. Well, regardless, that was the start of Stan's illustrious career in radio. Kalgoorlie enabled Stan to get a thorough grounding in the craft of copywriting whilst honing his talent behind the microphone. I think he took it all like a duck takes the water. He was born for it. He had his 21st birthday in Kalgoorlie, and by April 1942 his sojourn there came to an end. 6 p.m. summoned him back to Perth. This time he really was in the big smoke. He would have liked to think that his star shone so brightly in Kalgoorlie that Papa Whitford simply had to have such a luminary on the main station. It was not so. The war was well and truly on, and young men were being called up in droves, including 3 from 6 p.m. in 1 week. The others were waiting in the wings. Earlier, at 6kg, as he said himself, he suffered the illusion that girls would flock like light besotted moths to his side, to the side of any radio announcer. Well, it didn't happen. Not for him anyway. None of this did anything to dampen his inner core of self-belief, and a good thing too. Having been involved in the media most of my life, I can say that the aura of too many media personalities outshone their reality. But not our Stan. He earned every ounce of his self-esteem. At 6 p.m, not only was he behind the microphone on air, he was thrust into the spotlight conducting community concerts that were broadcast live. Live, actually, not recorded and edited and then put to air. In 1942, the technology to record was still around the corner. Stan became the host of community concerts at Fremantle Town Hall. Him, with his lame leg, hobbling across the centre stage and the waiting microphone. If that wasn't courage, I don't know what is. In the 1940s, ring and give appeals had begun. They were to radio what telethon and appealathon are to today's television. In August 1944, 6 p.m. staged just such an appeal to help bushfire victims. How topical is that? Papa Whitford called in reinforcements from his stations in Kalgoorlie and Gervas. And who do you think turned up from 6kg? You guessed it. A lovely, sweet, demure, butter wouldn't melt in her mouth gal called Arlie Jack. It seems that Stan took one look at her and could hardly wait to whisk her away for a coffee at the old wheat sheaf on the corner of King Street and St George's Terrace. Talk about being smitten. Stan couldn't take his eyes off her. Well, he did take his eyes off her, because he and another bloke left Perth for Sydney. And the really big smoke, he had no particular job prospects, just a belief that something would turn up. For someone claiming to lack self-confidence, Stan was not afraid to take big chances, as you'll learn. He landed a job at 2CH and settled in. He then wisely decided a dose of self-improvement was necessary, speech lessons. It turned out to be the most stimulating cultural experience of his life. As he wrote, "My horizons were about to spread. My culture, my behaviour, yes, my voice too. He learned to breathe. He learned how to pronounce vowels and consonants. More importantly, his teacher took him under his wing and became his mentor and exposed him to Greek drama and Greek philosophers and great poetry and Shakespeare." How fortuitous was that? Some of the speeches he committed to memory remained in easy reach to the end of his days. And as if all this wasn't enough for an impressionable young man, something else turned up in Sydney. That something else was the lovely lady he met at 6 p.m. What more could a young man want? I mean, he was touched, but not in any religious sense, although there was undoubtedly a touch of worship in his feelings for Eileen. She was the woman in his life. If anyone knows that, I do. Sure, he found some other women interesting and amusing, but the love of his life was Eileen. Well, the rest, as they say, is history. For family reasons, Eileen returned to Perth and 18 months later returned to Sydney, where they were married. Another turning point. In 1950, Stan and Eileen embarked on a voyage that was to accelerate the transformation of the boy from Coolin into the worldly man he became. England and the continent were revelations. The way of life, the culture, and just as importantly, the bonds that were consolidated between the two young people. Courage again, self-belief. Stan had it in spades. March 1951 marked yet another turning point, thanks to a friendly parson in Henley. The fellow had the same hip condition as Stan, and he showed Stan his surgical boot, urging Stan to follow suit. This required a medical inspection, resulting in a prescription for a tailor-made, or should I say bootmaker-made boot, with a platform sole. This diminished his limp and took the pressure off his right leg. Thus transformed, Stan and Eileen toured Europe by bicycle and then returned to Perth, working their passage as escorts to 22 children bound for Fairbridge. They arrived back in 1952. Being back meant getting back to work in radio, of course. The only opening was that of a copywriter at 6IX, and it was not that far from a copywriter's desk to the microphone. And tried to keep Stan away from a microphone at that age. And Stan soon found himself on air again. Then the program manager died, and Stan was offered the job, and he grabbed it. This was right up his alley. He had the experience, he had the maturity, and he had the confidence to manage a bunch of egotistical announcers. He positively blossomed. He was a key element in 6IX being the highest rated radio station in Perth, a vital position if the station's sales representatives were to sell time. 16 years later, it was time to reinvent himself, and Stan, at the age of 49, started a wallpaper business called Wallpaper World. He did it well, he was successful, but after 16 years in the business, it was time to move on and do what he'd always deep down wanted to do, and that is to write. That was 1985. He was 65, and the question was, what to write? He pottered around with thoughts of playwriting, made an attempt at a novel, travelled again in Europe and Southeast Asia with Eileen. Finally, he was struck with inspiration, and the beginning of that inspiration was right here in the Peninsula Hotel, while taking part in working bees to restore the place and save it from being demolished. He was aware that the builder Gus Lieber had also built His Majesty's Theatre. Later, on a trip through Perenjori and Pathara, he learned about Lieber's building activities in Woburn. Then he discovered the fire graves of Dalwallinu, and the game was on. He was like a man possessed. Every Friday when we had lunch, he wouldn't shut up about it. He'd talk about enthusiasm and commitment. The months rolled by, and eventually a manuscript was completed. Stan submitted it to a publisher, who sat on it for 9 months, and then sent him a rejection slip, accompanied by some critical comments recommending corrections. Stan bit the bullet and started work on the book again, revising and correcting. 6 more months passed and he decided to self-publish. So in 1991, 1,000 copies were printed, and after careful marketing, the first edition was sold out in less than 5 months. There have been 3 subsequent editions and 11 other books. So at the age of 72, with the publication of 5 Graves at Dalwallinu, Stan had reinvented himself again. He went on to write the 11 more books, the last in 2009 when he was 89. Through those 17 years, Stan also found time to speak to groups and gatherings of people such as Probus. All in all, several hundred engagements, something he enjoyed doing. Through all the years, Stan continued to give his time, his advice and his affection to his friends. I'm sure that Don Pierce, does anybody know Don Pierce apart from Stan Stanley? And Terry Spence, like me, had their own special personal bond with Stan. In my case, I can prove there was a deep metaphysical connection. In 1999, my wife and I were in France travelling on the super-fast train from Marseille to Paris. It was early afternoon, Saturday the 11th of December. Stan's 80th birthday was on Monday the 13th of December. And there was a party for him at his son David's home on the Saturday before. Now picture this. Sherry and I were skimming through the French countryside, halfway to Paris, and I wondered if I could connect with Perth on my mobile phone. I could, and I did. Stan's daughter-in-law, Anna, answered. Now, change the scene to Snell Street, Maylands. Stan was starting his guest of honour speech. He began by having a shot at me, in particular, my absence. He said, "I'm sorry that my friend Ian Parkes is not here to share in my 80th birthday. He thought it would be more worthwhile if he and his wife went to the final of the Davis Cup in Nice." Before he could say another word, Anna walked in with the phone and said, "Ian Parkes is on the phone." Now, if that's not evidence of the telepathic communication of a spiritual bond that circled the globe, I don't know what is. Well, that may be a load of rubbish, but it's certainly about love. If I've rambled on for too long, forgive me. The timing of this little presentation tonight, the 18th of April, is quite significant. Stan died on Thursday the 15th of April last year, and his funeral was 1 week later. So for me, an anniversary eulogy seems very appropriate. Stan gave pleasure and inspiration to thousands of people in all walks of life. If I had to isolate one quality of his that shone the brightest amongst all his other attributes, it would be his sense of humour. He possessed a quick wit, a creative turn of mind that saw humour in the most unlikely situations. Banter was his forte, although sometimes it backfired if the recipient was not in tune. Most of the people relished his refreshing outlook. A vibrant sense of humour is essential in keeping our lives in perspective. Stan certainly helped me to keep my life in perspective. I could not have had a better lifelong friend. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful, really talk about Stan. Ian, please, if you wouldn't mind staying. Stan we knew all the things that you've said about him, and you knew him much better than we did, but he was a friend. He was, like you said, if you asked him, would he come and talk to here? We often had him along for the council. When we had an event here, we'd get Stan to come, and he would never refuse. He was, we had a great friendship with him, and we've enjoyed his books, and we enjoyed his humour as well. But I at one stage wanted him to support a person who was running on the council, and he didn't do it without quite a lot of questioning, and he sat me down and we talked about this particular person, and he agreed, and he then authorised the stuff, but he always read it before he actually would allow it to be printed. He did it very thoroughly, and he was a great help, and it was a great help to the person who was duly elected to have Stan's name at the bottom of her advertising material. So we thanked him for that. But thank you very much. It was great. We will now have that, as you're probably aware, we've got it on camera. We have it, the audio, and we'll pass that on to the libraries, and we have it in our collection. We pass it on to the Batty Library as well. So we will we'll have very fond memories of Stan, and we'll have that tape. And
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much again. Now, we always offer a little, very little gift just as an appreciation. We have a wine, a red or a white, or a box of chocolates. I don't know which one of those you might select, but whichever.
Yes, thank you.
We'd like to give you some little gift.
Thank you, thank you.
So you tell me which way you want.
I'd like to try the red.
Would you? Good. All right.
Because Stan and I only ever drank red together.
That one. It's not a very fancy bag.
That's all right.
Ian, thank you so much. Yes, Eileen?
A little story about how he tried to find his first job in radio with Stan, and he got very smartly told that he wasn't that good.
Eileen, would you like to come and tell us yourself? Because we'd love to have you on the film.
No.
We'd love to have you on the film as well.
Well, honestly, Ian will tell it with more punch.
Well, in 1955, I had spent 5 years of my youth, all my youth, working on sheep stations in South Australia and in Western Australia. And I decided that it was time to do something else. And I'd been in hospital, for a couple of months, and I met a fellow there called John Samuel. He was a young lawyer, and I developed a friendship, and I said, what I'd really like to do is be a radio announcer. And he said, oh, that's all right. He said, my dad, he's the manager of the #1 radio station, 6AX. He'll fix you up with a radio announcer's job. We'll sort that out for you. So he sent me down to 6AX in Murray Street, and I met Bryn Samuel. He was about this high, about that wide, and a Welsh extraction, quite a character. And he said, oh, well, it's not really my role to employ announcers. I'm going to introduce you to the program manager, who was Stan Gervas. So I was a country boy wearing gabardine trousers and a tweed jacket and a wool tie and a pork pie hat. And I strolled in and met Stan, and Stan said, well, you want to be a radio announcer? We better get you to do an audition. So I did an audition, and I sat down in Stan's office, which is about as, not quite as big as this alcove. And between his desk and the wall, there was just room to get a chair, and I sat in his chair with my pork pie hat twirling between the knees, and Stan said, he said, with your voice and your personality, he said, I think I'd forget it if I were you. And I said, oh, okay. And I got ready to walk out, and he said, however, he said, I've got a vacancy for a copywriter. I said, what's that? And he said, well, the copywriter writes ads. I said, oh, right, okay. So he said, if you'd like to try for that, you can write a few commercials for me. You can do 100 words on Rayners tomato sauce and 50 words on Zippel's furnishings, and come back and show me, and I'll see if you've really got any potential. So I went back to the boarding house I was living in, or staying in Kings Park Road. 10 boarding houses at Kings Park Road, and sat up and listened to the radio. I wrote these commercials, and at 10 o'clock next morning I was there again with the same gabardine trousers and tweed jacket and wool tie, and I said, here you are, and I showed him this, and he read through these, and he scowled and he frowned. And, oh my God. Done it again. I was about to walk out, and he looked up and said, you've got the job if you want it. And I went, what? I was dumbfounded. And he said, I think I can make something out of here. Well, I got the job, and I started at an enormous typewriter about this, with a carriage about this big behind a door, and I had to really teach myself to type. And Stan taught me how to write copy. And we had many struggles. I was there for a year, and we had many struggles because he was always correcting my copy. I had to give it to him for approval and had to, in a 50-word commercial, he had to mention the advertiser's name 3 times. It was sort of standard, up front, in the middle, and at the end of the end, and all sorts of different things. And I had to write my copy and give it to Stan, and then Stan would go through with his red pen and cross things out and really write them. And I was like, I started really, I used to get fed up with this. So I decided I'd bypass him, and so I wrote some copy, and I went into the studio and I put it into the log where it was supposed to go, and then went back. And it wasn't long before Stan came back and his arm came around the door and he said, "Did you write this and put it in the log?" "Yes, I did." "Don't do that sort of thing without showing me first." So he sort of kept me in line. It sorted me out. But he was a great mentor, and he became a very dear friend at that time. He introduced me to English newspapers, and which are one of them themselves. And so we stayed in touch with each other all our lives, right to the end.
Thanks. Just before you go, Ian, Colin's got a question, I believe.
Yes,
you might answer for us.
I was only 8 years old, and Macquarie Network opened up 6MD, so there was 6IX, 6MD and WB. They were part of Macquarie
And
Network.
BY. WB, MD and BY.
Yeah, and BY. And I was only 8 years old and pushed up to the front of the crowd in the official opening, and all the singers and all that.
Yeah.
And the father was in the Rhodes Board at the time, and of course we had to hang around in the car while they had their refreshments. I thought I'd just let you know about that. But 6MD's written up, and the old American Mercuries, just about blow by blow, who was hearing it, and how far out they were, and the army were receiving good signals and so forth.
It's a different age then.
They were 100 mile is the limit really in all that signals.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Folks, please put your hands.